Hello viewers, my name is Adam and this is Seeking Me Productions, bringing you another video game review. So we discuss a lot about superheroes in this channel, ranging from movies and TV, and it's mainly broken into the two major companies of Marvel and DC. And in this video we will be discussing essentially a video game that's about Marvel's #1 superhero, which is Spider-Man. And a character who is no stranger to the video game spectrum in the industry, essentially because he's mainly toe-to-toe when it comes to Batman in the video game spectrum. But Insomniac developed an exclusive title for the PlayStation 4 that essentially reboots the Peter Parker story in video game form. Right off the bat, this is basically a story that brings Spider-Man back to form, and especially an improvement over the past video game outings ever since the release of Spider-Man 2 back in 2004. A lot of that game is heavily influenced in this new iteration of Spider-Man, from the story and then also the gameplay. But what the story does is, even though it does take plot elements from that movie adaptation of the Spider-Man 2, it does make its own way as it brings in new characters and other plot developments, and how it essentially expands upon Peter Parker's world within this new rebooted Marvel universe. Something that is unique in this game is that out of a majority of most outside medium for Peter Parker or Spider-Man's narrative story, is that in this game he is more of an adult than other outings, as when he's traditionally shown as a high school student in his early days as a superhero, but refreshingly we are telling a story about adult Peter Parker in his early 20s as he's finally progressing in his career, not only in Spider-Man but also his professional outside superhero antics. So much is great detail from how Sony is able to balance out not only his superhero career, but how his Peter Parker's personal lives, as it does a great emphasis on the supporting characters from Mary Jane to Aunt May and other classic villains that do find their way into the story, but it brings something new and later, as this is essentially a modern take on Peter Parker's story, what we are usually accustomed to. Now, bear in mind that I did say that Spider-Man 2 back in 2004 is a heavy influence on the plot, and it's very much so, as Peter Parker, instead of him being a Daily Bugle photographer, he thankfully is upgraded to being an assistant as a scientist. But the influence from Spider-Man 2 is how the story is mainly revolved around Peter's relationship with the known antagonist of Dr. Octavius. But so much is also taken care of when fleshing out other aspects to Peter Parker's life. Again, with the characters that this game does really good with fleshing out, they also bring in more modern additions that are based on the comic book lore. Mr. Negative is a character who heavily impacts Peter Parker's life in this game, both personal and as Spider-Man. But something that's even more integral that helps define this iteration of Spider-Man is the introduction of Miles Morales. More on him later. Now, even though Insomniac is doing such a great job with trying to balance out all these aspects from Peter Parker's personal life and Spider-Man, the game does eventually come to this very emotional, surprisingly heartfelt story that is very prevalent and slightly more essential to any Spider-Man story. In fact, I prefer this iteration of Peter Parker than the one that the MCU is currently going out, because this does feel like an essential Spider-Man media. But I like to carry on with how the gameplay goes, because this is a video game and not a movie. As again, I like to heavily express how much Spider-Man 2 is so much of an influence of the game, from based on the open world setting of how New York is presented. Again, most open world games you do follow a main story, but of course you have multiple plot lines that branches out through side missions. Something that the game also takes influence from is from another video game superhero franchise, which is the Batman Arkham series, that is mainly expressed through the combat and the stealth. So the gameplay, even though it's highly familiar from that series, it does take on more of its own personal unique aesthetics, as of course the webbing the mechanics is something that's unique to Spider-Man, but him able to use gadgets is something that expressed through Peter Parker's own engineering prowess. Navigation is key throughout the city, as his trademark web slinging is an absolute must, and is essentially the core reason why this game succeeds on a multiple front, especially an open world aesthetic that this game presents. You're able to maneuver across the buildings, from slinging from skyscraper to skyscraper, and even doing some parkour skills that does well when also want to show off what you can do and also increase in experience points by gaining more abilities down the line. The game also features on the production side of things that is something unique to the most superhero stories, is the fact that not only are you able to play as Spider-Man, but you also play as Peter Parker as well. These little moments of the game, they're far in between, but they're essentially you when you're going throughout the charitable organization that Peter occasionally visits throughout the game, who's someone who's connected to one of the main antagonists, but also when you're also going around being an assistant scientist through hacking and puzzles. Other characters that you do play as, surprisingly, is Mary Jane Watson and Miles Morales, who these moments mainly take it to more of a stealth-centered perspective, but the controls for these characters are so limited and that you don't necessarily express well their differences and how you approach the moments in the game that they do come out. So it's very much an uneven experience when you're playing as non-Spider-Man characters. Like as I already stated, that the New York is presented in its best quality, as well as the character models. When it comes to bringing to life a lot of Peter Parker's and Spider-Man's supporting cast and enemies. Now, one of the things that I don't really like about the production is when they decide to do the basically a remastered version of the game, where they essentially had to face swap the voice actor, at least face swap Peter Parker's look to suit mainly the Tom Holland's character. They say that the reason is mainly because of motion capture reasons, but the voice actor who still carries over from not only to Spider-Man's PS4 and Spider-Man Miles Morales is Yuri Lowenthal, an actor who is very known in the voice acting community, someone who I also was able to interview back in the Ubicon video, and the initial design is very much based on the voice actor. Someone who is able to present Peter Parker, his pathos, his emotional struggles, his wit, and his charisma through and through. So it's very jarring when they decided to remaster it back then. The game really wants you to explore New York in its entirety, as there are multiple collectibles that you can find throughout the city that like from the Peter Parker's backpacks that help give out details to his past and other comic book lore. There's one thing that I also like about them exploring the city is the mere fact that how much they were able to really recreate New York City to how it is in modern day today, as well as how it subtly fleshes out the Marvel Cinematic universe, at least in this iteration, very well, as there are multiple locations and spots that are basically directly from the Marvel Comics, from Daredevil, Matt Murdock's law attorney firm, to even Avengers Tower. something that you'll find scattered throughout the city. But overall, basically the whole package of this game is that they wanted to create a very definitive take on Spider-Man. Most likely Peter Parker and his entire world as of his point in life, which he has essentially been Peter Parker for Spider-Man for 8 years now, since his coming out as a superhero. With Miles Morales PS4 5 initial title release, that game takes place 6 months after the story of Spider-Man's PS4 ends, and I'll say that even though that it was is marketed as its own game, it's quite disappointing that the game is too short for me to even consider it to be its own thing. Now, mind you, the story of Miles Morales is unique to that character. Is able to bring in aspects to Miles' own content and his own characters and his relationships into the forefront, something that is heavily being expressed in other forms of media, i.e. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and also some other Spider-Man cartoons as of late. And Miles Morales is a fine and welcome addition to the Spider-Man canon, and something that this game does well to express both how they are able to express how his multicultural background is heavily explored through his relationships, as well as his part of the city that he's mainly operating in, which is the Harlem aspect of New York. His gameplay, when you play the Spider-Man Miles Morales, is essentially still the same thing that when you're playing as Spider-Man back in PS4, when you play as Peter Parker. Some of the new additions that's unique to Miles Morales is the mere fact that he does have 2 additional mutations based off his own gameplay that's really directed from straight out of the comics. From his Venom Sting that essentially creates electrical power up through his physical abilities, as well as him being able to camouflage, which are nicely good for stealth-like missions and to evade obstacles. But for the most part, the story is super short, and the side missions that, even though they are they are like fun, and especially for a narrative sense, they're more like rehashes from what you were able to do with Peter Parker back in the initial release of Spider-Man PS4. But yet again, it does still manage to tell a very effectively emotional story, same thing, because that is simply what a great Spider-Man story is able to do. Balance out the everyday struggles of not only your everyday life, but also the superhero one as that. So despite the mere fact that Miles Morales is being marketed as its own title, it mostly plays itself as very extended DLC. And it shows because of essentially it's mainly more of an extension of the initial PS4 back when it was out. Now to give the verdict to both Spider-Man PS4 and Spider-Man Miles Morales, I'm giving it as if it is one entity, despite the mere fact that they're being marketed as 2 different titles. I'm going to give both of these stories as one package a great game. Now, if only they were able to fine-tune those the supporting character aspects in the initial game, or Miles Morales was even much more longer experience, this would be a completely different review for both those outings. But it brings down to the fact that they're just telling you just one long story that was brought up, and Miles Morales is essentially more of an epilogue to that first game. So there you have it. That was my review for Marvel Spider-Man and Miles Morales. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Comment below what was your experience and how do you feel about the very, very steep price that they are giving out for Miles Morales. And also, what is your opinion on this next-gen outing of video games? How would you define and what would be the game that really do basically showcase what it means to be a PS5 or Xbox Series X game? Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.